The story of Singapore. How Lee Kuan Yew built one of the richest countries on earth. In 1965, almost nobody believed Singapore would survive. It wasn't simply a small country. It was a country that many argued shouldn't have existed at all. Stretching across just a tiny island at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, Singapore had virtually none of the advantages normally associated with successful nations. It had no oil reserves like the Gulf states, no vast farmland capable of feeding its people, no gold, diamonds, or valuable minerals buried beneath its soil. It didn't even have enough fresh water to support its growing population, forcing it to import much of its water from neighboring Malaysia. To many economists and political leaders of the time, Singapore appeared destined to become another struggling post-colonial state. The odds were overwhelming. The island had a rapidly growing population, high unemployment, severe housing shortages, and deep ethnic divisions between Chinese, Malays, and Indians. Organized crime flourished throughout the city. Corruption was common across public institutions, and thousands of families lived in overcrowded slums without proper sanitation or electricity. Then came the event that changed everything. On August 9, 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia. Unlike most nations that fought long wars to achieve independence, Singapore became independent because another country no longer wanted it. The separation was sudden, painful, and deeply uncertain. Overnight, a small island with almost no natural resources found itself responsible for defending its own borders, creating its own economy, and convincing the rest of the world that it deserved to exist. Even its own prime minister doubted whether the country could survive. During a nationally televised press conference announcing Singapore's separation, Lee Kuan Yew, normally known for his discipline and composure, struggled to contain his emotions. As cameras rolled, he paused repeatedly, fighting back tears while describing the breakup with Malaysia. It remains one of the most famous political speeches ever recorded, not because of what he said, but because viewers could see the enormous weight resting on his shoulders. He understood what independence truly meant. There would be no larger nation to protect Singapore, no vast domestic market to rely upon, no natural wealth waiting to be exploited. If Singapore failed, millions of people would pay the price. Around the world, few expected success. Many international observers predicted economic collapse. Some believed Singapore would eventually be forced to reunite with Malaysia, which had recently confronted Malaysia militarily, might view the vulnerable island as an easy target. Investors saw little reason to risk money in a country whose future seemed so uncertain. Yet while the world focused on everything Singapore lacked, Lee Kuan Yew focused on what it could become. He believed geography could become an advantage instead of a limitation. Sitting along one of the busiest shipping routes on Earth, Singapore occupied a strategic position connecting Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. If the country couldn't rely on natural resources, perhaps it could become indispensable through trade, finance, technology, and human talent instead. It was an extraordinary gamble. Rather than trying to imitate larger nations, Lee wanted Singapore to become something entirely different, a country where honesty replaced corruption, education replaced natural resources, efficiency replaced bureaucracy, and long-term planning mattered more than short-term political popularity. Many of his ideas were controversial. Some would later be criticized for limiting political freedoms. Others would become models studied by governments around the world. But taken together, they produced something almost nobody thought possible. Within a single generation, Singapore transformed from one of Asia's poorest cities into one of the richest countries on Earth. Its skyline became filled with futuristic skyscrapers. Its port grew into one of the busiest on the planet. Its airport became one of the world's best. Global corporations established regional headquarters there. Living standards soared. Corruption virtually disappeared. And the country that once worried about survival became one of the world's leading financial centers. Today, Singapore consistently ranks among the richest nations by GDP per capita, one of the safest cities in the world, and one of the most competitive economies ever built. But none of it happened by accident. Behind every policy, every reform, and every difficult decision stood one man with an almost relentless belief that his country could overcome impossible odds. This is the story of Singapore, and how Lee Kuan Yew built one of the richest countries on Earth. Chapter 1. The boy who refused to accept Singapore's fate. Long before Lee Kuan Yew became one of the 20th century's most influential political leaders, he was simply a boy growing up in colonial Singapore. Born on September 16, 1923, Lee entered a society firmly controlled by the British Empire. Singapore was an important trading port, connecting ships traveling between Europe, India, China, and the rest of Southeast Asia. Wealth flowed through its harbors every day, but very little of it stayed with the people who actually lived there. British officials occupied the highest positions in government and business, while the local population remained divided along ethnic and social lines. Chinese, Malays, Indians, and Eurasians often lived in separate communities, attended different schools, and spoke different languages. Opportunities depended heavily on where you were born, who your family knew, and which part of society you belonged to. Young Lee grew up in a middle-class Chinese family that valued education above almost everything else. From an early age, it became clear that he possessed an unusually sharp mind. Teachers described him as intelligent, disciplined, and fiercely competitive. Unlike many children who were satisfied simply passing examinations, Lee wanted to finish first. He believed excellence wasn't something you occasionally achieved. It was something you pursued every single day. That competitive mindset would later define both his leadership and the country he eventually built. Like many children growing up under British rule, Lee attended English-language schools. At first glance, this appeared to be another example of colonial influence. In reality, it gave him an enormous advantage that few people recognized at the time. By becoming fluent in English while also understanding Chinese culture, Lee developed the ability to move comfortably between two very different worlds. Years later, this would allow him to negotiate confidently with Western leaders while maintaining credibility throughout Asia, an ability that proved invaluable as Singapore sought investment from every corner of the globe. But before any of that could happen, the world changed overnight. In December 1941, Imperial Japan launched its campaign across Southeast Asia. British commanders had long insisted that Singapore was an impregnable fortress. Its massive naval base and coastal defenses were considered among the strongest in the British Empire. Many believed that if war ever reached Singapore, the city could withstand almost any attack. They were disastrously wrong. Rather than attacking directly from the sea, Japanese forces advanced rapidly through the Malay Peninsula, moving far faster than British planners had imagined possible. Within weeks, Singapore found itself surrounded. Then, on February 15th, 1942, the impossible happened. Britain surrendered. It remains one of the greatest military defeats in British history. For the people of Singapore, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The Japanese occupation lasted more than 3 years and fundamentally changed Lee Kuan Yew's understanding of power, leadership, and survival. He later described those years as some of the most important of his life. The occupation was brutal. Food became scarce. Fear became part of everyday existence. Thousands of civilians lost their lives during mass executions, while ordinary families struggled simply to survive. The certainty that British rule had once provided disappeared almost instantly, replaced by the harsh reality that powerful empires could collapse far more quickly than anyone imagined. For Lee, one lesson stood above all others. A nation that cannot defend itself can never truly control its own future. That belief would eventually shape nearly every major decision he made as Prime Minister. From mandatory military service to massive defense spending, Lee never forgot how quickly Singapore's security had disappeared during the war. When Japan surrendered in 1945, British administration returned, but the illusion of imperial invincibility had been permanently destroyed. Across Asia, nationalist movements were growing stronger. People who had once accepted colonial rule now demanded independence. Lee Kuan Yew was among them. Determined to continue his education, he traveled to the United Kingdom, where he studied law at Cambridge University. It was there that his intellectual abilities truly flourished. He graduated with exceptional results, earning one of the highest academic distinctions available while impressing professors with both his discipline and analytical thinking. Yet Cambridge offered him more than an education. It introduced him to politics. Post-war Britain was experiencing enormous social and political change. Ideas about democracy, self-government, economic planning, Workers' rights and national independence dominated university discussions. Students from across the British Empire debated what the future of their own countries should look like once colonial rule inevitably came to an end. Lee absorbed these conversations with remarkable intensity. Unlike some students who became captivated by revolutionary ideology, he remained intensely pragmatic. He wasn't interested in political theories simply because they sounded appealing. He wanted ideas that actually worked. That practical mindset would later become one of his defining characteristics. For Lee, ideology always came second. Results came first. When he returned to Singapore in 1950, he found a city on the edge of enormous change. British colonial authority was weakening. Trade unions were becoming increasingly powerful. Communist influence was spreading throughout Southeast Asia. Ordinary citizens demanded greater political representation, while the future of Singapore itself remained deeply uncertain. For most young lawyers, this would have been an opportunity to build a comfortable legal career. For Lee Kuan Yew, it was the opportunity to build an entirely new nation, and before long, he would gather a small group of like-minded colleagues to create a political movement that would change Singapore forever. Chapter 2. Independence. That nobody wanted, most countries celebrate the day they become independent. Singapore mourned it. On the morning of August 9, 1965, there were no nationwide celebrations, no military parades, and no fireworks lighting up the skyline. There were no crowds waving flags in excitement or politicians declaring victory after decades of struggle. Instead, there was uncertainty, fear, and a nation that had just been told it was now completely on its own. To understand why Singapore's independence was so unusual, it's important to understand that Lee Kuan Yew never intended for Singapore to become an independent country. His original vision was something much larger. After the Second World War, many British colonies across Asia began moving towards self-government. Singapore was no exception. As political movements gained momentum during the 1950s, Lee believed the island's future depended on joining a larger federation rather than standing alone. Singapore had serious limitations. Its land area was tiny. Its population was growing rapidly. It lacked natural resources. It couldn't even produce enough food or water for its own people. Economically, remaining connected to the Malay Peninsula made perfect sense. A common market would allow businesses to trade freely. Industries could expand beyond the island, and Singapore would benefit from the security and resources of a much larger nation. For Lee, merger wasn't simply desirable, it was essential. That opportunity appeared in 1963 when Singapore officially joined the newly formed Federation of Malaysia alongside Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak. At first, it looked like the solution Lee had spent years fighting for. The merger promised economic growth, political stability, and a stronger future for everyone involved. But beneath the surface, serious tensions were already developing. The biggest challenge wasn't geography, it was politics. Lee Kuan Yew believed Malaysia should become a nation where every citizen, regardless of race or religion, enjoyed equal rights and equal opportunities. His People's Action Party promoted the idea of a Malaysian Malaysia, a country built around citizenship rather than ethnicity. Many leaders in Kuala Lumpur saw things differently. Malaysia's political system gave special privileges to the ethnic Malay majority, while Singapore's population was overwhelmingly Chinese. As political disagreements intensified, they quickly became intertwined with ethnic tensions, creating an increasingly unstable situation. The disagreements soon spread beyond Parliament. Political speeches became more confrontational, public trust deteriorated. Communities that had lived alongside one another for generations found themselves drawn into disputes they hadn't created. Then, in 1964, violence erupted. Race riots broke out in Singapore, leaving dozens dead and hundreds injured. Streets that had once been filled with shoppers and families suddenly became scenes of fear and destruction. Curfews were imposed as security forces struggled to restore order. For Lee, the riots were deeply personal. He had always believed Singapore's greatest strength was its diversity. Chinese, Malays, Indians, and Eurasians all played essential roles in the island's success. If racial conflict became permanent, the country would never achieve the stability needed to prosper. Unfortunately, relations between Singapore and the Malaysian federal government continued to deteriorate. Economic disagreements added further pressure. Singapore wanted a genuine common market to encourage trade and investment, but progress was slow. Political leaders on both sides increasingly viewed one another as obstacles rather than partners. Eventually, Malaysia's Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman reached a dramatic conclusion. The partnership could not continue. Rather than attempting years of political compromise, he proposed something almost unimaginable. Singapore would leave Malaysia entirely. For Lee Kuan Yew, the news was devastating. He had dedicated years of his political life to achieving merger, believing it represented Singapore's only realistic future. Now, the very goal he had worked so hard to accomplish was collapsing before his eyes. On August 9, 1965, the Malaysian parliament voted unanimously to expel Singapore from the federation. In a matter of hours, Singapore became an independent nation, not because it had demanded independence, because it had been rejected. Later that day, Lee Kuan Yew appeared before television cameras to explain what had happened. Normally calm and disciplined, he struggled to speak. As reporters questioned him about the separation, his voice began to break. He paused repeatedly. Then, unable to contain his emotions, he cried. For one of Asia's toughest political leaders, it was an extraordinarily rare public display of vulnerability. Years later, Lee explained why. He wasn't crying because he had lost a political battle. He was crying because he genuinely feared for his country's survival. The challenges were overwhelming. Singapore had no army capable of defending itself. Its neighbors were significantly larger. Indonesia had only recently ended a military confrontation known as konfrontasi. Relations with Malaysia were uncertain. The economy depended heavily on trade. Unemployment remained high. Foreign investors had little confidence in the island's future. Even basic necessities posed enormous problems. Singapore still relied heavily on Malaysia for its water supply. If political relations deteriorated further, one of the country's most essential resources could suddenly become a bargaining tool. International observers were equally pessimistic. Many believed Singapore would eventually collapse economically. Others predicted it would be forced back into Malaysia within a few years. Some analysts even questioned whether such a small state could survive at all in a region dominated by much larger neighbors. Lee listened to every prediction. Then he ignored them. Rather than focusing on what Singapore lacked, he began asking a different question. What if a country didn't need natural resources to become wealthy? What if its greatest resource could be its people? That single idea would become the foundation of modern Singapore. And over the next decade, Lee Kuan Yew would begin implementing a series of reforms so ambitious that they would transform one of the poorest cities in Asia into one of the richest countries on Earth. The impossible experiment had officially begun. Chapter 3. Turning Poverty into Prosperity. When Singapore became independent in 1965, Lee Kuan Yew faced a question that few leaders in history have ever had to answer. How do you build a successful country when your nation has almost nothing? There was no oil to export, no fertile farmland to feed the population, no gold, diamonds, or natural gas waiting beneath the ground. Even fresh water had to be imported. Many economists argued that Singapore simply lacked the basic ingredients needed for long-term prosperity. Throughout history, wealthy nations had usually relied on abundant natural resources, large domestic markets, or strategic military power. Singapore possessed none of them. Lee Kuan Yew reached a radically different conclusion. If Singapore couldn't rely on natural resources, it would have to become a nation built entirely on human resources. That philosophy became the foundation of everything his government did over the following decades. Instead of asking how Singapore could exploit its land, Lee asked how it could maximize the potential of every citizen living on it. The transformation began with something surprisingly simple: clean government. During the 1960s, corruption was a normal part of life across much of Asia. Bribes were often expected before business licenses could be approved. Government contracts frequently depended on political connections rather than competence. Public money disappeared into private pockets, while ordinary citizens learned to accept corruption as an unavoidable part of daily life. Lee refused to accept that. He believed corruption wasn't simply unethical, it was economically disastrous. Why would international companies invest billions of dollars in a country where contracts could only be won through bribery? Why would talented people remain in government if dishonest officials were rewarded while honest ones struggled? Almost immediately, his government gave extraordinary powers to the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, an agency responsible for investigating corruption at every level of society. Unlike many anti-corruption agencies that focused primarily on low-ranking officials, Singapore's investigators could pursue anyone, including senior ministers and powerful business leaders. Nobody would be above the law. The government also adopted another controversial policy. Civil servants would be paid exceptionally well. Lee argued that if the country wanted the best lawyers, economists, engineers, and administrators running the government, it needed to compete with the private sector. High salaries reduced the temptation of bribery while attracting talented professionals who might otherwise choose corporate careers. Critics argued that politicians were being overpaid. Lee responded that corruption cost far more than competitive salaries ever could. Over time, the results became undeniable. Singapore developed one of the cleanest and least corrupt governments in the world, a reputation that dramatically increased investor confidence and became one of the country's greatest competitive advantages. But honesty alone couldn't create jobs. Singapore still faced enormous unemployment. Thousands of young people entered the workforce each year, yet there weren't enough businesses to employ them. Without rapid industrialization, independence could quickly become an economic disaster. This was where Lee made perhaps the boldest decision of his career. Rather than protecting local industries from foreign competition, he actively invited the world's biggest companies to invest in Singapore. At the time, this idea was deeply unpopular. Many newly independent countries believed foreign corporations represented a continuation of colonial influence. Governments across Africa, Asia, and Latin America often nationalized industries, restricted foreign ownership, or imposed heavy regulations designed to protect domestic businesses. Lee chose the opposite strategy. He believed multinational corporations didn't represent a threat. They represented an opportunity. If companies like Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, Shell, Philips, and General Electric could be convinced to build factories in Singapore, they would bring something the country desperately needed: jobs, technology, skills, international credibility. To make Singapore attractive, the government established the Economic Development Board, commonly known as the EDB. Its mission was unlike that of almost any government agency at the time. Instead of regulating business, it actively competed for it. Officials traveled across Europe, Japan, and the United States, meeting with corporate executives and encouraging them to establish operations in Singapore. Investors were promised political stability, low corruption, efficient infrastructure, skilled workers, and a government committed to long-term economic planning. It was an entirely different way of thinking. Rather than waiting for investment to arrive naturally, Singapore went out into the world and aggressively pursued it. At the same time, massive construction projects were reshaping the country itself. One of the most ambitious was Jurong. At the time, Jurong was little more than swampland on the western side of Singapore. Many critics laughed when the government announced plans to transform it into a major industrial estate. Newspapers even mocked the project, calling it Goh's Folly after Finance Minister Goh Keng Swee, believing nobody would ever build factories in such an isolated area. They couldn't have been more wrong. Roads were built, ports were expanded, factories appeared, international manufacturers arrived. Within a few years, Jurong had become the heart of Singapore's industrial economy, employing tens of thousands of workers and proving that careful planning could achieve what many believed impossible. Yet Lee understood that factories alone wouldn't guarantee long-term success. The country's greatest investment had to be education. Natural resources eventually run out. Knowledge doesn't. Schools began emphasizing mathematics, science, engineering, and technical skills rather than purely academic theory. English became the primary language of education, not because Lee wanted to erase local cultures, but because he understood English had become the language of international business. A Singaporean engineer needed to communicate with an American company. A Singaporean banker needed to negotiate with clients from London. A Singaporean entrepreneur needed access to global markets. English became the bridge connecting Singapore to the rest of the world, while students continued learning their own mother tongues to preserve their cultural identities. It was another example of Lee's pragmatism. Identity mattered, but opportunity mattered too. By the early 1970s, the results of these reforms were becoming impossible to ignore. Foreign investment surged, factories multiplied, employment rose dramatically. Average incomes began climbing year after year. The tiny island that experts once dismissed as economically hopeless was rapidly becoming one of Asia's fastest-growing economies. And Lee Kuan Yew wasn't finished, because creating factories was only the first step. His next ambition was far greater. He wanted Singapore to become the financial capital of Asia. Chapter 4. Becoming Asia's financial capital. By the early 1970s, Singapore had achieved something few thought possible. The economy was growing, factories were creating jobs, foreign companies were investing billions of dollars. Living standards were improving faster than almost anyone had predicted. For many governments, that level of success would have been enough. For Lee Kuan Yew, it was only the beginning. He understood that manufacturing alone could never guarantee Singapore's future. Countries with lower wages would eventually compete for the same factories, forcing businesses to relocate in search of cheaper labor. If Singapore wanted to remain prosperous for generations, it couldn't simply build products. It had to become indispensable to the global economy. That meant transforming the country into something far more ambitious, a financial and trading hub connecting East and West. Fortunately, geography was already on Singapore's side. Situated at the southern entrance to the Strait of Malacca, the island occupied one of the most strategic locations on Earth. Every year, thousands of ships carrying oil, electronics, automobiles, food, and raw materials passed directly through these waters. Nearly every major trade route connecting Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia crossed Singapore's doorstep. Lee believed geography alone wasn't enough. Ships would only stop in Singapore if doing so was faster, safer, and more efficient than anywhere else. So the government invested heavily in infrastructure. Singapore's port expanded at an extraordinary pace. New terminals were constructed, cargo handling became increasingly automated, and customs procedures were streamlined to reduce delays. Every minute saved loading or unloading ships translated into money for global shipping companies, and Singapore became obsessed with efficiency. While many ports struggled with bureaucracy and congestion, Singapore developed a reputation for speed and reliability. That reputation became one of its greatest competitive advantages. Over time, the port of Singapore grew into one of the busiest ports in the world, handling millions of shipping containers every year. Even today, it remains one of the most important gateways for international trade, connecting hundreds of ports across dozens of countries. Yet Lee wasn't content with dominating maritime trade. He also wanted Singapore to dominate the skies. During the 1970s, air travel was becoming increasingly important to international business. Executives needed to move quickly between continents, multinational corporations required reliable logistics, and tourism was beginning to emerge as a major economic force throughout Asia. Singapore needed an airport that reflected its ambitions. The government made another bold decision. Instead of expanding the aging Paya Lebar Airport, officials chose to build an entirely new international airport on reclaimed land in the eastern part of the island. Many questioned the enormous cost. Lee viewed it as an investment rather than an expense. When Changi Airport officially opened in 1981, it immediately set new standards for aviation. Designed with efficiency, comfort, and long-term expansion in mind, it offered airlines and passengers an experience unlike almost anywhere else in the world. Over the decades, Changi became more than just an airport. It became a symbol of Singapore itself, spotlessly clean, perfectly organized, remarkably efficient. Today, it consistently ranks among the world's best airports, welcoming tens of millions of passengers each year and serving as one of Asia's most important aviation hubs. But perhaps the most significant transformation was happening inside Singapore's financial sector. Lee understood that international businesses needed more than factories and ports. They needed banks, insurance companies, investment firms, legal services, a stable financial system they could trust. To attract global finance, Singapore maintained strict economic discipline. Government spending remained carefully controlled, inflation stayed relatively low, and the country's legal system earned a reputation for fairness and predictability. Investors knew contracts would be enforced, property rights would be protected, and sudden political instability was extremely unlikely. That level of confidence proved invaluable. One by one, major international banks established regional headquarters in Singapore. American banks arrived. European banks followed. Japanese financial institutions expanded throughout the city. Soon, Singapore had become one of Asia's most important centers for international finance, competing directly with Hong Kong for regional dominance. Unlike many countries experiencing rapid economic growth, Singapore also avoided one of the most common mistakes. It didn't borrow recklessly. Around the developing world during the 1970s and 1980s, governments accumulated enormous debts while financing ambitious infrastructure projects. When global economic conditions changed, many found themselves trapped in financial crises that took decades to overcome. Lee insisted on a different approach. Economic growth had to be sustainable. Budgets had to remain disciplined. Public finances had to be carefully managed. That fiscal responsibility became another defining feature of Singapore's development, allowing the country to weather global recessions far more effectively than many of its neighbors. At the same time, Singapore moved beyond low-cost manufacturing. Rather than competing solely on cheap labor, the government encouraged companies to invest in higher-value industries such as electronics, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals, biotechnology, and advanced engineering. Education evolved alongside the economy. Universities expanded. Technical institutes trained highly skilled workers. Research and innovation received increasing government support. Singapore wasn't simply attracting investment anymore. It was attracting talent. By the 1990s, the transformation was astonishing. The slums that had once defined much of Singapore had largely disappeared. Modern office towers dominated the skyline. Luxury hotels welcomed business travelers from around the globe. Multinational corporations treated Singapore as their gateway to Southeast Asia. Average incomes had risen dramatically. Poverty had fallen. The country that once struggled to create enough jobs was now competing with the world's richest nations for investment, technology, and skilled professionals. International observers who had predicted Singapore's collapse were now asking a very different question. How had such a tiny island achieved what so many larger countries had failed to accomplish? The answer wasn't just economic policy. It was an entirely different philosophy of government, one that would become known around the world as the Singapore model. Chapter 5. The Singapore Model. By the 1990s, Singapore had become one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Foreign leaders visited the island to understand its success. Economists studied its policies. Business executives praised its efficiency. Newspapers described it as an economic miracle. But alongside the admiration came another question. How exactly did Singapore achieve all of this? The answer wasn't simply free markets. It wasn't just strong leadership, and it certainly wasn't luck. Singapore had developed its own governing philosophy, one that blended capitalism, long-term planning, strict law enforcement, and meritocracy into what would eventually become known as the Singapore model. Unlike many governments, Lee Kuan Yew rejected the idea that countries had to choose between a strong state and a strong economy. He believed they needed both. Markets could create wealth, but government had to create the conditions that allowed markets to succeed. That meant keeping taxes competitive while investing heavily in infrastructure. It meant encouraging entrepreneurship while maintaining strict regulations against corruption. Most importantly, it meant making decisions based on long-term national interests rather than short-term political popularity. This approach wasn't always popular, but Lee rarely governed according to opinion polls. He governed according to outcomes. Perhaps nowhere was this philosophy more visible than in housing. When Singapore became independent, hundreds of thousands of people lived in overcrowded slums. Fires were common, sanitation was poor, and entire families often shared tiny rooms without running water or proper sewage systems. Lee believed that no country could become prosperous if its citizens lacked safe, affordable homes. The solution was the Housing and Development Board, better known as the HDB. Instead of allowing uncontrolled urban expansion, the government launched one of the largest public housing programs in modern history. Entire neighborhoods were carefully planned before construction even began. Schools, parks, public transportation, shopping centers, healthcare facilities, and recreational spaces were all integrated into new housing estates. The goal wasn't simply to build apartment buildings, it was to build communities. Through the Central Provident Fund, or CPF, Singaporeans could use mandatory savings accumulated during their working lives to help purchase their homes. This created something remarkable. Within a few decades, Singapore achieved one of the highest homeownership rates in the world. For Lee, this wasn't just an economic policy. It was a nation-building strategy. People who own homes tend to invest more deeply in their communities. They have a greater stake in political stability, economic growth, and the future of their country. Homeownership helped transform millions of Singaporeans from temporary residents into long-term stakeholders in the nation's success. Education formed another pillar of the Singapore model. Lee often repeated a simple belief: natural resources are finite, human talent is not. Since Singapore possessed almost no natural resources, every child represented an investment in the country's future. Schools emphasized mathematics, science, engineering, and practical problem-solving. Teachers were held to exceptionally high standards, while universities maintained close relationships with industries to ensure graduates possess skills employers actually needed. Unlike many education systems built primarily around theory, Singapore focused heavily on preparing students for the modern economy. As a result, Singaporean students consistently ranked among the world's highest performers in international mathematics and science assessments. Healthcare followed a similarly pragmatic approach. Rather than adopting either a completely free public healthcare system or an entirely private one, Singapore created a hybrid model. Citizens contributed to healthcare savings through the CPF system, while government subsidies ensured essential medical care remained affordable. Personal responsibility existed alongside public support, creating one of the world's most efficient healthcare systems without placing unsustainable pressure on government finances. The system wasn't perfect, but it consistently delivered excellent health outcomes at costs significantly lower than many developed countries. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Singapore model, however, involved law and order. Lee Kuan Yew believed economic success depended upon social stability. Investors needed confidence that contracts would be honored. Families needed to feel safe walking through neighborhoods. Businesses needed predictable laws and reliable institutions. To achieve that stability, Singapore introduced some of the strictest laws in the developed world. Drug trafficking carried severe penalties. Littering attracted substantial fines. Chewing gum sales were heavily restricted for many years to prevent damage to public infrastructure. To many foreign visitors, these rules appeared excessive. Critics argued they limited personal freedoms and reflected an overly paternalistic style of government. Supporters responded with a different argument. The streets were clean. Crime remained remarkably low. Public transportation was efficient. Corruption was virtually non-existent. Citizens generally felt safe at almost any hour of the day. Whether one agreed with every policy or not, the results were difficult to ignore. This balance between order and freedom became one of Singapore's defining characteristics. Lee openly rejected the idea that Western liberal democracies offered the only path to national success. He argued that different societies faced different challenges, and that governments should be judged primarily by whether they improved people's lives. That philosophy earned him both admiration and criticism. Human rights organizations frequently questioned restrictions on political opposition, press freedom, and public demonstrations. Critics argued that Singapore's political environment gave the ruling People's Action Party too much influence over national life. Lee never denied these criticisms. Instead, he defended his priorities. He argued that without stability, discipline, and effective government, Singapore would never have escaped poverty. It was a debate that continues today. Can economic prosperity justify tighter political controls? Or should political freedoms always take precedence, regardless of economic outcomes? There is no universal answer. But there is one undeniable fact. The Singapore model produced extraordinary results. By the early 21st century, Singapore ranked among the world's richest countries by GDP per capita. It consistently placed near the top of global rankings for education, healthcare, infrastructure, ease of doing business, innovation, and quality of life. The tiny island that experts once predicted would fail had become a country others were desperately trying to understand. And at the center of that transformation stood a man whose influence had grown far beyond Singapore's shores. Because by the time Lee Kuan Yew stepped away from power, world leaders from Washington to Beijing were studying the lessons of the nation he had built. Chapter 6. Lee Kuan Yew's Legacy. On November 28, 1990, after serving as Prime Minister for more than 31 years, Lee Kuan Yew stepped down. For many nations, the retirement of a leader who had dominated politics for 3 decades would have triggered uncertainty. Investors might worry about instability. Citizens might fear that years of progress could quickly disappear. Rival political factions could compete for power, undoing the policies that had driven economic success. Singapore experienced none of those things. That was perhaps Lee's greatest achievement. He hadn't built a country that depended on one man. He had built institutions capable of functioning without him. His successor, Goh Chok Tong, inherited a nation that was politically stable, economically competitive, and internationally respected. Unlike many newly industrialized countries that struggled after leadership transitions, Singapore continued moving forward with remarkable consistency. The policies evolved, new challenges emerged, and different leaders introduced their own ideas, but the foundations remained unchanged. Clean government, long-term planning, investment in education, economic openness, meritocracy. These principles had become larger than Lee himself. Even after leaving the office of Prime Minister, Lee remained one of the most influential figures in Singaporean politics. Serving first as senior minister and later as minister mentor, he continued advising younger leaders while allowing a new generation to take responsibility for governing the country. Many observers found this transition remarkable. Throughout history, countless leaders had refused to surrender power, believing that only they could protect their nation's future. Lee thought differently. He believed the true measure of leadership wasn't how long one person remained in office. It was whether the system continued working after they were gone. That philosophy was tested repeatedly during the 21st century. Singapore weathered the Asian financial crisis. It recovered from the global financial crisis of 2008. It adapted to the rapid rise of China. It remained one of the world's leading financial centers, despite increasing global competition. Each challenge reinforced the same conclusion. The institutions Lee had built were stronger than any individual politician. Yet perhaps Lee's greatest influence wasn't inside Singapore. It was around the world. As Singapore's success became impossible to ignore, presidents, prime ministers, economists, and business leaders traveled to the island to understand how such a small nation had achieved so much. One of the leaders who studied Lee Kuan Yew most closely was Deng Xiaoping. When China began opening its economy during the late 20th century, Deng viewed Singapore as proof that rapid economic development could occur without sacrificing political stability. Chinese officials regularly visited Singapore to study everything from industrial planning and urban development to education and public administration. Even today, many Chinese cities continue drawing inspiration from policies first implemented in Singapore decades earlier. the influence spread far beyond Asia. Leaders across the Middle East admired Singapore's ability to transform limited natural resources into extraordinary economic success. Dubai, in particular, pursued many of the same principles that had helped Singapore thrive: world-class infrastructure, business-friendly regulations, global connectivity, and long-term strategic planning. Although the two cities followed different paths, comparisons between Singapore and Dubai remain common because both transformed geography into a competitive advantage rather than a limitation. Economists also became fascinated by what became known as the Singapore miracle. For decades, conventional wisdom suggested that countries required large domestic markets, abundant natural resources, or massive populations to become wealthy. Singapore challenged every one of those assumptions. With a population of just a few million people and virtually no natural resources, it achieved living standards higher than many nations dozens of times its size. The lesson was profound. Good governance could sometimes matter more than natural wealth. Human capital could become a country's greatest resource. Institutions could create prosperity where geography could not. Of course, Lee Kuan Yew's legacy remains complex. Supporters view him as one of history's greatest nation builders, a leader who rescued his country from poverty, eliminated corruption, created world-class institutions, and delivered prosperity to millions of people. Critics argue that his government maintained tight control over political opposition, restricted press freedom, and prioritized order over certain civil liberties. Human rights organizations have frequently pointed to these issues when evaluating Singapore's political system. Lee never attempted to avoid these criticisms. Instead, he defended his philosophy openly. He believed leaders should ultimately be judged by whether they improved the lives of ordinary citizens. In his view, ideology mattered less than results. Whether people agree with that philosophy continues to spark debate among historians and political scientists. But almost everyone agrees on one point. Few leaders have transformed their country as completely as Lee Kuan Yew transformed Singapore. When he passed away on March 23, 2015, at the age of 91, the nation came to a standstill. Hundreds of thousands of Singaporeans lined the streets despite heavy rain, waiting patiently for hours to pay their final respects. Many had never known another leader during the country's formative years. Many had grown up in the homes his government built, studied in the schools his reforms created, worked in the industries his policies attracted. Their lives had been shaped by decisions he made decades earlier. His funeral wasn't simply the farewell of a former prime minister. It was the farewell of the man who had turned an island that wasn't expected to survive into one of the richest and most respected nations on Earth. Chapter 7. The next 50 years will be even harder. When Singapore celebrated its 50th birthday in 2015, the country was no longer fighting for survival. It had already won that battle. The question facing Singapore had fundamentally changed. For the first 50 years, the challenge was how to become rich. For the next 50, the challenge is how to stay rich. History suggests that becoming wealthy is difficult. Remaining wealthy is even harder. Throughout history, countless cities and civilizations have experienced periods of extraordinary prosperity before gradually declining. Venice once dominated Mediterranean trade before losing its influence. Detroit became one of the richest industrial cities in America before manufacturing shifted elsewhere. Hong Kong spent decades as Asia's undisputed financial gateway, but now faces growing competition from mainland China and other regional hubs. Singapore's leaders understand this better than anyone. They know economic miracles don't last forever unless they continue adapting. That realization explains why Singapore rarely behaves like a country satisfied with its achievements. Instead, it behaves like a country constantly preparing for the next challenge. Perhaps no issue illustrates that better than demographics. For decades, Singapore encouraged families to have fewer children. During the 1960s and 1970s, rapid population growth threatened housing, education, and employment. Government campaigns promoted smaller families, believing slower population growth would improve living standards. The strategy worked, perhaps too well. Today, Singapore has one of the lowest birth rates anywhere on Earth. Every year, Fewer babies are born than the generation before them. The consequences stretch far beyond family life. A shrinking younger generation means fewer workers entering the economy. At the same time, people are living longer than ever before. Singaporeans now enjoy one of the highest life expectancies in the world, regularly exceeding 83 years. This is, in many ways, a remarkable success. Healthcare improved. Living standards increased. People simply live longer. But economically, it creates a difficult equation. A smaller workforce must support a growing retired population. Healthcare spending rises. Pension systems face increasing pressure. Economic growth naturally begins to slow. Are facing exactly the same demographic challenge. Singapore simply arrived there earlier. The government has responded in several ways. Retirement ages have gradually increased. Older workers are encouraged to remain employed longer. Automation is replacing repetitive labor. Artificial intelligence is becoming a national priority, but one solution has generated the most public debate: immigration. Walk through Singapore today and you'll hear dozens of languages. People from nearly every continent now call Singapore home. Highly skilled professionals work in finance. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of migrant workers from neighboring countries build skyscrapers, maintain infrastructure, and keep the economy functioning. Without immigration, Singapore's economy would struggle to maintain its current pace. Yet immigration comes with trade-offs. Some Singaporeans worry about increasing competition for jobs. Others fear rising housing costs. Some worry national identity could slowly change as the foreign-born population grows. The government must carefully balance economic necessity with social stability, a balance that becomes more difficult every year. Housing presents another challenge. Ironically, the country famous for solving its housing crisis now faces a new version of the same problem. Singapore's public housing system remains one of the world's most successful. More than 3/4 of citizens continue living in HDB apartments, and home ownership remains exceptionally high. Yet private property prices have surged over recent decades. As Singapore became wealthier, international investors also began viewing its real estate as one of the safest assets in Asia. That increased demand pushed prices upward. The government has repeatedly introduced cooling measures, additional property taxes, and restrictions on speculative investment. Its objective remains the same as it was under Lee Kuan Yew: ensure ordinary Singaporeans can continue owning homes. But maintaining affordability in one of the world's richest cities is becoming increasingly difficult. Then there is climate change. Few countries face rising sea levels as directly as Singapore. Much of the island sits only a few meters above sea level. Scientists estimate that significant sea level rise over the coming century could threaten coastal infrastructure unless massive protective measures are implemented. Singapore has already committed tens of billions of dollars towards seawalls, drainage systems, pumping stations, and coastal engineering projects designed to protect future generations. Once again, long-term planning defines the national response. The government isn't simply solving today's problems. It's preparing for challenges decades before they become crises. Technology presents another opportunity and another risk, just as it transitioned from shipping to manufacturing, and from manufacturing to finance. It now hopes to become one of the world's leading knowledge economies. The hope is that Singapore's next economic miracle won't come from factories. It will come from ideas. Chapter 8. Can the Singapore model be copied? Every year, presidents, prime ministers, economists, urban planners, and CEOs travel to Singapore hoping to answer one question: how did they do it? And perhaps more importantly, can we do the same? It's an understandable question. After all, Singapore transformed itself from one of the poorest countries in Asia into one of the richest in just a few generations. If another country could simply copy Singapore's formula, it could potentially change the lives of millions of people. But that's where the story becomes more complicated. Because over the last 50 years, dozens of governments have tried to recreate Singapore's success. Some borrowed its economic policies. Others copied its urban planning. Many attempted to build cleaner governments, stronger institutions, and business-friendly economies. A few achieved impressive progress. Most did not. The reason is simple. People often copy Singapore's results. Very few copy the discipline that produced those results. Take corruption, for example. Many governments announce anti-corruption campaigns. Politicians promise transparency. Special commissions are created, new laws are passed. Yet after a few years, little changes. Why? Because fighting corruption isn't simply about writing tougher laws. It's about enforcing them consistently, even when the people involved are politically powerful. Lee Kuan Yew understood this from the very beginning. He knew investors wouldn't trust slogans. They would trust results. When Singapore investigated corruption, it didn't matter whether the suspect was a junior official or a senior minister. The law applied equally. That created something many countries still struggle to build: confidence. Businesses don't invest billions of dollars because politicians make promises. They invest because institutions prove those promises can be trusted. That distinction is often overlooked. Singapore didn't become wealthy because it said the right things. It became wealthy because it consistently did the right things for decades. Another lesson concerns infrastructure. Today, countries around the world are racing to build modern airports, skyscrapers, ports, highways, and financial districts. Many assume these visible projects are what made Singapore successful. But Singapore's infrastructure wasn't built to impress tourists. It was built to solve economic problems. The Port of Singapore wasn't expanded to create impressive statistics. It was expanded because every additional shipping container created jobs, investment, and trade. Many cities build iconic buildings before building strong institutions. Singapore built strong institutions first. The skyline came later. Perhaps the country most often compared with Singapore is Dubai. At first glance, the similarities are striking. Both are relatively small. Both transformed themselves into global business hubs. Both invested heavily in world-class airports, ports, luxury tourism, and international finance. Both attract talented workers from around the world. Both understand that location can become an economic advantage. But their paths were very different. Dubai benefited enormously from oil revenues during its early development, even though it later diversified beyond energy. Singapore never had that luxury. Every dollar invested in infrastructure came from careful economic planning rather than natural resource wealth. That forced Singapore to be exceptionally disciplined from the beginning. Another fascinating comparison is Rwanda. Following the devastation of the 1994 genocide, Rwanda faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding almost every national institution. Its leaders frequently pointed to Singapore as a model for economic transformation. Like Singapore decades earlier, the progress has been remarkable. Kigali has become one of Africa's cleanest and most organized cities. Economic growth has accelerated, international investment has increased. Yet Rwanda also illustrates how difficult the Singapore model truly is. Singapore spent decades building institutions, educating its workforce, expanding its economy, and integrating itself into global trade. Those achievements cannot be replicated overnight. Development is measured in generations, not election cycles. In 1965, Singapore's future looked hopeless. It had no natural resources, no army capable of defending itself, no guarantee that it could even provide enough water for its own people. Most experts believed the tiny island would struggle simply to survive. Instead, it became one of the greatest economic success stories in modern history. Today, Singapore ranks among the world's richest nations, boasts one of the busiest ports on Earth, operates one of the world's finest airports, and consistently ranks near the top in education, healthcare, safety, innovation, and quality of life. None of that happened because Singapore discovered oil. None of it happened because of geography alone. And none of it happened by chance. It happened because one leader refused to accept that his country's limitations would define its future. Lee Kuan Yew understood something many governments still struggle to recognize. A nation's greatest resource isn't buried underground, it's the people who live there. By investing in education instead of natural resources, integrity instead of corruption, long-term planning instead of short-term politics, and competence instead of ideology, Singapore achieved what many believed impossible. Its story isn't simply about economics, it's about vision, discipline, leadership, and the extraordinary impact one generation can have when it chooses to build not just for the next election, but for the next 50 years. Today, skyscrapers dominate Singapore's skyline where overcrowded slums once stood. Global companies compete to establish headquarters there. Millions of travelers pass through Changi Airport every year. The country's influence stretches far beyond its tiny borders. Few people looking at modern Singapore would ever imagine that, just 60 years ago, the world expected it to fail. Yet perhaps that's exactly why its story continues to inspire nations across the globe. Because Singapore proved that greatness isn't determined by the size of a country. It's determined by the size of its ambition.